Night falls over an ancient city. The wind carries smoke through narrow streets. Somewhere in the distance, a child is crying. The year is 701 BC, and the city of Lachish is dying. Outside its walls, tens of thousands of soldiers move in the darkness. Like a living shadow, shields overlap. Spears glint in the firelight. Siege towers creak forward on massive wooden wheels. Above them all, banners ripple in the hot desert wind. Each banner bears the same symbol, a winged god. This is the army of Assyria, the most feared empire the ancient world has ever known. Inside Lachish, panic spreads. Families rush through the streets carrying whatever they can hold: water jars, children, sacks of grain. The city gates are sealed. The defenders line the walls. They know what is coming, because everyone knows what the Assyrians do to those who resist. They do not simply conquer cities. They make examples of them. At the center of the Assyrian camp stands a massive royal tent, illuminated by torchlight. Inside, a king studies the walls of Lachish. His name is Sennacherib, King of Kings, Lord of the four corners of the world. And tonight, he intends to remind the world why no one dares challenge Assyria. But Sennacherib is not just planning a battle. He is planning a message, because the Assyrians understand something about power that no empire before them truly grasped. Winning wars is not enough. You must make your enemies too terrified to fight at all. And the Assyrians perfected this strategy with chilling precision. They carved their victories into stone. They displayed the suffering of their enemies in royal palaces. They wanted the world to see exactly what happened to anyone who dared resist them. In one carving, prisoners kneel as soldiers raise blades above their heads. In another, captives are marched away in chains. And in others, the punishments become even more horrifying. These images were not hidden. They decorated the walls of the royal palace. Foreign ambassadors walked past them. Rebel leaders saw them. Every visitor received the same silent warning. This is what happens if you defy Assyria. Back outside Lachish, the siege engines roll closer. Massive ramps rise against the city walls. Archers raise their bows. Then suddenly, the horns sound. The Assyrian army surges forward. Arrows rain down like a storm of iron. Defenders scream from the battlements as ladders slam against the walls. Within hours, the city's defenses begin to collapse. But the worst is yet to come, because once the Assyrians capture a city, the real terror begins. Survivors will be dragged from their homes. Families will be separated. Thousands will vanish into slavery. And the leaders of the rebellion will face punishments designed to shock the entire ancient world. Punishments so brutal that historians still debate them nearly 3,000 years later. Yet here is the most disturbing part of this story. The Assyrians were not ashamed of their brutality. They were proud of it. They wrote about it. They celebrated it. They turned terror into a political weapon. And for centuries, it worked. From the mountains of Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean, dozens of kingdoms trembled at the mere rumor of an Assyrian army approaching. Because when the Assyrians marched to war, cities did not just lose battles. Sometimes, they disappeared from history entirely. But this raises a disturbing question. How did one civilization become this ruthless? What kind of empire builds its power not just on conquest, but on fear itself? To understand that, we have to go back much further. Back to the beginning. To a small city on the banks of the Tigris River. A city called Ashur. A place where one of the most terrifying empires in human history was about to be born. And when it did, the ancient world would never be the same again. Long before Assyria terrified the ancient world, before the massive armies, before the siege engines, before kings carved their victories into stone, there was only a small city. It sits on a bend of the Tigris River, surrounded by dry plains and distant mountains. The city is called Ashur. Today it looks ordinary. Mud brick homes, narrow streets, a modest temple rising above the rooftops. But this unremarkable settlement will one day give birth to one of the most feared empires in history. To understand why, we need to understand where the Assyrians lived. Because geography often shapes destiny. The ancient world knew this region as Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. To the south lay fertile plains, where powerful civilizations like Sumer and later Babylon thrived. Cities there grew rich from agriculture, irrigation, and trade. But Ashur was different. It sat far to the north, and the north was a much harsher place to live. The soil was less fertile, rainfall was unpredictable, and most importantly, Ashur sat at the crossroads of powerful and often hostile neighbors. To the east, the Zagros Mountains sheltered tribes that frequently raided the plains. To the north, powerful kingdoms rose and fell in the rugged lands of Anatolia. To the south, the great cities of Babylon competed for control of trade and territory. Ashur was surrounded, not by allies, but by potential enemies. That meant survival required something more than prosperity. It required strength. But at first, the Assyrians did not build an empire with swords. They built it with trade. Thousands of years ago, merchants from Ashur began traveling north into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. There they established trading colonies known as karams. These settlements became bustling hubs where merchants exchanged tin and textiles for precious silver. Clay tablets discovered by archaeologists reveal an astonishing level of organization. Contracts, letters, business partnerships, even complaints about late shipments. One merchant writes to his partner, "Why have you not sent the tin I requested?" The caravan waits. Another tablet records family disputes over profit. In other words, these were not just traders, they were entrepreneurs. And through this trade network, Ashur became wealthy. But wealth in the ancient world often attracts danger. Caravans carrying silver had to cross hundreds of miles of rugged terrain. Bandits lurked in mountain passes. Local rulers demanded taxes, and rival powers watched carefully. So the merchants of Ashur developed something unusual for a trading city. They organized protection. Guards escorted caravans. Fortified outposts protected trade routes. And gradually, a culture began to emerge. A culture that valued discipline, organization, and strength. This survival mindset shaped the Assyrians in ways that would define their future. Unlike the southern cities, which relied heavily on irrigation and agriculture, Ashur's prosperity depended on control. Control of trade. Control of roads. Control of territory. And control requires power. Slowly, over generations, the city evolved. Merchant leaders gained influence, military leaders gained authority, and the king, once primarily a religious figure serving the god Ashur, began taking on a more aggressive role because the Assyrians believed something profound about their city. They believed it belonged not just to them, but to their god. The god Ashur was not merely a protector. He was a divine ruler. The Assyrian king governed the city on his behalf, which meant something extraordinary. Every victory in battle was not just political, it was sacred. And every expansion of Assyrian territory was seen as fulfilling the will of their god. This belief would become one of the most powerful engines of expansion in the ancient world. Because if your god commands you to expand his domain, then conquest becomes more than ambition. It becomes duty. But for centuries, Assyria remained relatively small. It survived. It traded. It defended itself. And sometimes, it was even conquered by stronger neighbors. Empires rose and fell around it. The Babylonians dominated the south. The Hittites grew powerful in Anatolia. Other kingdoms appeared and vanished in the mountains. Through it all, Ashur endured. Patient, resilient, learning, until finally, a king emerged who would transform this survival culture into something far more dangerous. A ruler who realized that the best way to survive in a hostile world was to become the most powerful force within it. His name was Ashur-uballit I, and under his leadership, the quiet merchant city of Ashur would take its first step toward becoming something far greater, an empire. But once the Assyrians began expanding, they would discover something unsettling about power. Because conquest is easy to start, but it is almost impossible to stop. Empires rarely explode into existence overnight. They grow, they adapt, they learn from every battle, and somewhere along the way, they discover the secret to power. For Assyria, that secret was not just ambition, it was innovation. By the time kings like Ashur-uballit I began ruling, in the 14th century BC, something remarkable is happening inside Assyria. The city of Ashur is no longer just a trading hub, trying to survive between larger powers. It is becoming something new, a military state. Because the Assyrians have learned a brutal lesson about the ancient world. Peace is temporary, enemies are inevitable, and survival belongs to whoever prepares for war before it begins. So the Assyrians begin to transform their army, and in doing so, they quietly invent something the world has never truly seen before: a professional military. In most ancient societies, armies were temporary. When war came, farmers put down their tools, picked up weapons, and marched to battle. When the war ended, they returned home. But Assyria abandons this model. Instead of calling soldiers only during emergencies, they create a force that trains constantly. Men whose full-time job is war. Men who march, drill, and fight year-round. For the first time in history, warfare becomes an organized profession. And this changes everything. Because a professional army does something part-time soldiers cannot. It evolves. Every campaign becomes a lesson. Every defeat becomes a blueprint for improvement, and the Assyrians improve relentlessly. One of their most important advantages begins in the fire of a forge: iron. For centuries, armies across the ancient world have relied on bronze weapons, bronze swords, bronze spearheads, bronze armor. But bronze has limitations. It requires tin, a rare resource that must be traded over long distances. Iron is different. Iron is harder, stronger, and more importantly, more abundant. The Assyrians become masters of ironworking. Their blacksmiths hammer glowing metal into deadlier blades, stronger spearheads, more durable armor. While many of their enemies still carry bronze weapons, Assyrian soldiers march into battle with iron. And on the battlefield, that difference matters. But weapons alone do not win wars. Strategy does. And here again, the Assyrians begin pushing warfare into terrifying new territory. For centuries, the most prestigious warriors of the ancient world rode chariots, light vehicles pulled by horses, carrying archers across the battlefield. Assyria uses chariots too. But they also experiment with something new: mounted warriors fighting directly from horseback, the earliest forms of organized cavalry. At first, these riders struggle with balance and control. Horses are difficult to manage in combat, but the Assyrians keep refining the system. Soon, cavalry units become faster than chariots, more flexible, perfect for chasing fleeing enemies or striking quickly across long distances. Yet perhaps the most frightening Assyrian innovation appears not in open battle, but at the walls of enemy cities. Because in the ancient world, cities were protected by massive fortifications, stone walls, high towers, heavy gates. For centuries, these defenses made many cities nearly impossible to conquer. Armies could surround them, but breaking through was another story. Until the Assyrians changed the rules, they developed something terrifyingly effective: the siege engine. Huge wooden machines reinforced with metal, mounted on wheels, covered with protective shields. Inside, soldiers swing massive battering rams designed to smash through gates and walls. At the same time, engineers build siege ramps, allowing soldiers to climb upward toward defenders. Archers provide cover. Engineers dig tunnels beneath walls. And slowly, the once impregnable defenses of ancient cities begin to fail. One by one, kingdoms fall. Cities that once believed themselves untouchable suddenly face a terrifying new reality. Assyria can reach them anywhere. Every campaign makes the Assyrian war machine stronger, more disciplined, more organized, more efficient. Because this is no longer just an army. It is a system, a machine powered by logistics, engineering, and relentless training. And at the center of that machine stands the Assyrian soldier. But behind the armor, behind the shield, is still a human being. Many of these soldiers were once farmers. Men who grew up working fields near the Tigris River. Men who once expected to inherit land and raise families. Now their lives have changed forever. Instead of tending crops, they march across foreign lands. Instead of planting seeds, they build siege ramps. Instead of harvest seasons, they live by campaign seasons. Year after year, the empire calls them to war. Victory brings glory, but also distance from home, distance from everything familiar. Because the machine of empire never stops moving. And now, Assyria begins expanding outward faster than ever before. Kingdom after kingdom falls under Assyrian influence. Tribute flows into the royal treasury: gold, silver, grain, prisoners. And as Assyria grows richer, its kings grow more ambitious. They no longer want to simply defend their homeland. They want dominance, control, an empire that stretches across the entire Near East. But expansion comes with consequences, because every conquered kingdom leaves behind something dangerous. Resentment, hatred, rebellion. And as Assyria's power spreads across the ancient world, so does its reputation, not just as conquerors, but as something far more terrifying. Because the Assyrians are about to discover a new weapon, a weapon even more powerful than iron swords, or siege engines, a weapon made of fear itself. And when they unleash it, the world will never see empire the same way again. Because absolute power does not just create greatness, it creates enemies, and those enemies are already watching, waiting for the moment Assyria shows its first weakness. By the 8th century BC, the Assyrian Empire has become something the ancient world has never seen before. Not just a kingdom, not just a regional power, but a superpower. From the mountains of Iran to the deserts of Arabia, from the Mediterranean coast to the mighty Nile River in Egypt, Assyria dominates the Near East. Tribute flows toward the Assyrian capitals like rivers of gold, silver, precious woods, exotic animals, and thousands upon thousands of captives. At the center of this vast empire stands a new generation of rulers, kings who will perfect the Assyrian system of control. Among them is one of the most transformative figures in Assyrian history, Tiglath-Pileser III. When he takes the throne in 745 BC, the empire already possesses powerful armies. But Tiglath-Pileser understands something deeper about ruling a massive empire. Conquest is not the hardest part. Control is. Because when an empire grows large enough, rebellion becomes inevitable. Distant cities grow restless. Local kings resent tribute. Subject populations dream of independence. Many earlier empires had collapsed under the weight of these rebellions. But Tiglath-Pileser introduces a system designed to stop them before they begin. He weaponizes fear. Now, brutality in war is nothing new in the ancient world, but the Assyrians turned it into something systematic, strategic, and psychological. When Assyrian armies capture a rebellious city, they do not simply punish its leaders. They send a message. Royal inscriptions boast openly about what happens to enemies. One king records, "I flayed the rebel leaders and draped their skins upon the city walls." Another boasts of building towers made from the heads of defeated soldiers. These accounts shock modern readers. But in the Assyrian worldview, they serve a purpose. Because these stories spread, merchants carry them along trade routes. Ambassadors whisper them in royal courts. Refugees tell them in neighboring cities. And suddenly, every kingdom in the region understands something clearly. Resisting Assyria could mean obliteration. The result is chillingly effective. Some cities surrender without a fight. Others pay tribute before Assyrian armies even arrive. Fear becomes a tool of governance, a silent army that marches ahead of the real one. But the Assyrians do not rely on terror alone. They also perfect another strategy, one that quietly reshapes the ancient world: mass deportation. When the Assyrians conquer a region, they often remove entire populations from their homeland. Families, farmers, craftsmen, scholars. Thousands of people forced to leave everything behind. They are then resettled hundreds or even thousands of miles away in another part of the empire. At first glance, this seems purely cruel. But again, there is strategy behind it. By scattering populations across distant regions, the Assyrians break local identities. A rebellious city can no longer unite around shared traditions or leadership. Instead, its people are absorbed into a vast multicultural system. Meanwhile, skilled workers strengthen other parts of the empire. A captured engineer might build canals in Mesopotamia. A craftsman might decorate palaces in distant capitals. In effect, the Assyrians create something unprecedented: a melting pot of civilizations. Over time, the empire becomes a mosaic of languages, cultures, and traditions. Babylonians, Phoenicians, Arameans, Elamites, Egyptians, all living under Assyrian rule, all connected by imperial roads, trade networks, and military power. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of Assyria's zenith appears far from the battlefield, inside its palaces. because while Assyrian kings conquered relentlessly, they also collected knowledge with the same intensity. In the 7th century BC, a powerful king named Ashurbanipal rules from the grand city of Nineveh. Ashurbanipal is not only a warrior, he is also something rare among ancient kings. A scholar. He proudly claims he can read and write the complex script of cuneiform. And under his command, scribes gather texts from across the empire. Clay tablets arrive from Babylon, ancient myths from Sumer, medical knowledge, astronomical observations, royal records, thousands upon thousands of tablets. They are stored carefully in a massive royal archive, the Library of Ashurbanipal. Within these tablets are some of humanity's oldest surviving stories, including the legendary Epic of Gilgamesh. Without this library, much of ancient Mesopotamian literature might have been lost forever, which creates a fascinating contradiction. The same empire that carved scenes of brutality into palace walls also preserved knowledge for future civilizations. They were conquerors, but they were also curators of culture, builders of monumental architecture, collectors of history, and symbols of their power stand everywhere. Gigantic winged bulls known as lamassu guard the gates of Assyrian palaces. Each statue weighs tons, carved from single blocks of stone. Part bull, part eagle, part human, they represent strength, wisdom, and divine protection. Visitors walking through these gates would feel small, insignificant, exactly as the empire intended. Because every detail of Assyrian power, from statues to armies to inscriptions, serves the same purpose: to project absolute dominance. And for a time, it works. The empire grows larger than ever before. Assyrian kings rule over millions of people. Their armies march farther than any before them. Their capitals glitter with wealth and monuments. It seems unstoppable. But there is a hidden weakness in systems built on fear. Fear works as long as the ruler remains strong, as long as enemies believe the empire cannot be challenged. But fear has a dangerous side effect. It breeds hatred, and hatred has a long memory. Across the vast territories of Assyria, conquered peoples are watching, waiting, listening for rumors, whispers that the empire might not be invincible after all, because an empire held together by fear stays together only as long as the king himself is feared. And when that fear begins to fade, the cracks begin to appear. Small at first, almost invisible, but slowly, the statue of empire begins to fracture. And when it finally breaks, the collapse will be so sudden that even the Assyrians will not see it coming. For nearly 3 centuries, the Assyrian war machine had seemed unstoppable. King after king expanded its borders. Army after army marched farther than the last. Cities fell, kings bowed. Tribute poured into Assyria like a river. And at the center of it all stood the magnificent capitals of the empire, Kalhu, Ur-Sharrukin, and finally the glittering metropolis of Nineveh. Nineveh is not just a city. It is the largest city on earth. Its walls stretch nearly 12 kilometers, reinforced with towering gates and defensive towers. Inside are grand palaces decorated with miles of carved stone reliefs. Gardens bloom with exotic plants from distant lands. Caravans arrive daily bringing goods from across the empire. To anyone standing inside Nineveh's walls, Assyria must have seemed eternal, unbreakable. But beneath this display of power, the empire is beginning to fracture, because maintaining an empire this large comes at a terrible cost. For generations, Assyrian kings have demanded constant warfare. Every year, armies march out again. North, south, east, west. Conquest is no longer an occasional necessity. It has become routine. Victory after victory builds glory for the king. But it also drains the empire, because armies require food, weapons, horses, armor, siege machines, and most importantly, men. Each campaign pulls more soldiers away from their homes, away from farms, away from families. Many never return. And slowly, the population of Assyria itself begins to shrink. The empire still looks powerful from the outside, but inside, the machine is wearing down. Even the treasury begins to feel the strain. Monumental building projects, massive armies, continuous wars, all of it costs enormous wealth, and while tribute still flows from conquered territories, the price of maintaining dominance keeps rising, yet the greatest threat to Assyria does not come from economics. It comes from something far more dangerous: politics. In 631 BC, the great king Ashurbanipal dies. The man who ruled over the largest empire in the world. The man who built the great library of Nineveh. The king feared by enemies across the Near East. And like many powerful rulers, he leaves behind a dangerous problem. 2 sons, both of whom believe the throne belongs to them. What follows is not a peaceful transition of power. It is civil war. Assyria's once unified war machine begins turning inward, brother against brother, general against general, cities forced to choose sides. The empire that once terrified the world now begins tearing itself apart. For the first time in centuries, Assyria looks vulnerable, and the world is watching. Across the mountains to the east, rising power is paying close attention: the Medes. For generations, the Medes have lived in the shadow of Assyria, sometimes paying tribute, sometimes resisting, but always remembering the Assyrian armies that marched through their lands, remembering the cities destroyed, remembering the humiliation of submission. Now, they see an opportunity. At the same time, to the south, another ancient rival stirs: the city of Babylon. Babylon had once been a great center of power and culture. But under Assyrian rule, it had suffered repeated domination. At times, Assyrian kings had even destroyed the city entirely. In 689 BC, one Assyrian ruler had famously razed Babylon to the ground. The memory of that destruction still burns in Babylonian hearts. And now, at last, Assyria appears to be bleeding. The leaders of these two powers begin to realize something extraordinary. Alone, neither could defeat the Assyrian Empire, but together, they might. And so an unlikely alliance forms. Historians sometimes call it the alliance of the oppressed, the Medes, the Babylonians, and other smaller kingdoms who had suffered under Assyrian rule, all united by one shared emotion: revenge. Across the empire, word begins to spread. Assyria is weakening. The kings are fighting each other. The once invincible army is divided. And for millions of people living under Assyrian domination, this rumor sparks something powerful: hope. Imagine a man living in a distant province of the empire. His grandparents were deported from their homeland decades ago. Forced to resettle in a foreign land, his family still speaks a different language, still remembers stories of the cities they once called home. For generations, they had no choice but to obey the Assyrian rulers. But now, for the first time in his life, the empire that controlled everything suddenly looks fragile. And in places across the Near East, rebellions begin to stir. Cities refuse tribute. Local leaders gather armies. The tide of fear that once protected Assyria begins to recede, and the enemies of the empire move quickly. Very quickly. From the east, the Medes begin marching across the mountains. From the south, Babylonian forces push north along the rivers. City after city falls. Assyrian strongholds collapse. The empire that once conquered the world now struggles just to defend itself. Like cracks spreading across a statue, the fractures grow wider and wider, until finally, the armies of the alliance arrive at the heart of Assyrian power. The greatest city in the ancient world, the capital of the empire, Nineveh. Before them rise enormous walls, massive gates, towering defenses built to withstand any enemy. But this time, the enemy is not just one kingdom. It is everyone Assyria ever oppressed. The armies gather. The siege begins, and the fate of the most brutal empire in ancient history will be decided here. In 612 BC, the siege engines roll once again, but this time, they are not Assyrian. They stand outside the walls of Nineveh. The city that once projected fear across the ancient world is now surrounded by enemies. The alliance of the oppressed has arrived. The Medes, the Babylonians, and other former subjects who have waited generations for this moment. They are not here for tribute. They are not here for negotiations. They are here to erase an empire. The great siege. Nineveh's defenses are formidable. Thick walls reinforced over decades. Gates protected by towers. Trained soldiers still defending the city. But the empire inside is already weakened. Resources are low. Leadership is fractured. Morale is collapsing. And outside the walls, the attackers prepare something devastating. The ancient chronicles describe a critical moment during the siege. Heavy rains swell the nearby rivers, or perhaps the attackers intentionally divert the waters. Historians debate the exact details, but what is clear is this. The flooding weakens parts of Nineveh's massive defensive walls. Water saturates the foundations. Mud brick begins to soften. Then, sections of the wall collapse. Through the breach, Allied forces surge into the city. What follows is chaos. Fires ignite across neighborhoods. Palaces are stormed. Soldiers clash in the narrow streets. The sound of battle echoes through halls that once hosted foreign ambassadors and tribute-paying kings. The royal palace, once the symbol of absolute power, becomes a target. Assyrian defenders fight desperately to protect their king and their capital. But resistance crumbles. One by one, strategic points fall. And then, the fires begin spreading uncontrollably. Wooden structures ignite. Roof beams collapse. Smoke rises into the sky. Nineveh burns. The library's irony inside the palace complex lies something extraordinary. Stacks of clay tablets carefully organized in chambers. The library of Ashurbanipal. Thousands of texts containing history, myth, medicine, astronomy, legal codes, poetry. Knowledge collected from across centuries. As flames engulf the palace, heat surges through the rooms. Wooden shelves burn. Ceilings collapse. But something unexpected happens. The fire that destroys the building bakes the clay tablets, hardening them, preserving them, transforming fragile records into stone-like artifacts that survive for millennia. The same catastrophe that erases the empire accidentally protects its memory. Thousands of years later, archaeologists uncover these tablets buried beneath ash. They decode the writing. They read the voices of kings who once boasted of conquest. They study myths that shaped ancient belief systems. Ironically, we know so much about Assyria today because its enemies burned its capital. Destruction became preservation. Total erasure after the fall of Nineveh. The Assyrian state does not recover. There are attempts at resistance. Some remnants fight on in other cities. But the heart of the empire is gone. The administrative system collapses. The army disintegrates. Subject territories declare independence. Within a few short years, Assyria ceases to exist as a political power. It is astonishing how quickly it disappears. An empire that once controlled vast lands. That commanded fear across continents. That built monumental cities, gone. Almost erased from memory. Centuries later, around 401 BC, the Greek historian Xenophon marches through the region with his army. He and his soldiers travel across northern Mesopotamia. They pass enormous mounds of earth. Ruins buried under dust. Broken walls. Abandoned structures. Xenophon sees these ruins. He describes them in his writings. But he has no idea who built them. No knowledge that beneath the soil lie the remains of the mighty Assyrian capitals. To him, they are mysterious relics of an unknown civilization. The empire that once dominated the ancient world had already faded from collective memory. Not destroyed in legend, but forgotten. That is perhaps the most powerful form of historical death. Erasure from identity, the cycle of empires. The fall of Assyria is not unique. It follows a pattern seen throughout history. Rise, expansion, peak power, overextension, internal conflict, external enemies waiting, collapse. Assyria teaches us something profound about power. Fear can unify an empire. Brutality can suppress rebellion. Military innovation can create dominance. But no system built primarily on coercion lasts forever, because fear does not generate loyalty. It generates compliance. And compliance disappears when strength fades. The alliance of the Medes and Babylonians did not defeat Assyria solely through superior weapons. They defeated it by waiting for weakness, by enduring oppression, by remembering grievances, and by striking at the precise moment when the empire could no longer defend itself. The final image today, the ruins of Nineveh, still stand. Near the modern city of Mosul in Iraq, large earthen mounds mark where walls once rose. Archaeologists continue to uncover artifacts from beneath the dust. Lamassu statues, tablets, Palace foundations, fragments of a civilization that once ruled the world. Visitors walking across these mounds may not immediately realize they are standing on the remains of one of history's most powerful empires, an empire that believed it had mastered power through fear, an empire that seemed unstoppable, until history proved otherwise. The story of Assyria does not end with its destruction. It continues in the tablets preserved by fire, in the military strategies adopted by later empires, in the political lessons learned by future rulers, and in the reminder that no power, no matter how dominant, exists outside the laws of time. Empires rise, empires expand, empires fall, and sometimes their greatest legacy is not their conquest, but the ruins they leave behind. The story of Assyria does not stay buried in the past. It lingers because the forces that built its empire are still present in our world today. We no longer build walls like Nineveh. We no longer carve victories into palace stones. But power still depends on many of the same tools. Technology, military strength, control of trade routes, information, and sometimes fear. Are we truly different from the Assyrian kings, who believe dominance guaranteed stability? Modern states project power through advanced weapons and global alliances. Corporations project influence through data and economic control. Nations enforce order through surveillance, law, and strategic force. The methods have evolved, but the principle remains familiar. Power seeks permanence, yet history repeatedly shows permanence is an illusion. Walk across the mounds of Nineveh today. They look like natural hills, covered in dust, quiet, unassuming. But beneath them lies a civilization that once ruled millions. A civilization that believed its walls were too strong to fall, its army too disciplined to break, its kings too feared to be challenged. And yet, it collapsed, as every empire before it had, and every empire after it will. There is a powerful lesson hidden in those mounds. Great powers often assume they are the exception to history, that their systems are smarter, their weapons superior, their institutions more resilient. But time does not negotiate. It erodes. Slowly, then suddenly. As historian analysts like to say, empires do not die because they are weak. They die because they overextend, because fear replaces legitimacy, because internal division weakens unity, because enemies wait patiently for opportunity. Assyria mastered conquest. It mastered intimidation. It mastered administration. But it could not escape the fundamental cycle of rise and fall. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of this story. Power without balance becomes self-destructive. If you thought Assyria was brutal, wait until you see what the Babylonians did after they inherited the ruins, or how new empires rose from the ashes with different strategies, but similar ambitions. That story continues, and it reveals how history repeats itself in surprising ways. If this journey into the most brutal empire of the ancient world fascinated you, subscribe to explore more civilizations that shaped human history. Leave a comment and tell us, can fear ever build a lasting nation? Or is stability only achieved through something deeper than intimidation? And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter. In humanity's rise and fall, the empire is gone, but its echoes remain, and history continues.